Sure.
Novelist in the room, I think, will understand that there's a moment that occurs. I see a smile of pained recognition. There's a moment that occurs where I think you're just sort of horrified by the terms that you've set for yourself as a novelist, and you kind of long for the book to be any other kind of book than than what it appears to want to be.
Laura van den Berg is the acclaimed author of two collections of stories, The Isle of Youth and What Will the World Look Like When All the Water Leaves Us, as well as the previous novel Find Me, which we hosted a wonderful event for back in 2015. Tonight, she's here to discuss her new novel with Paul, The Third Hotel, which has been garnering praise left and right. It's been called beautiful and unsettling by the Paris Review, exquisitely written by the Boston Globe, and a future cult classic by the New York Times Book Review. There's Borges and Bolaño, Kafka and Cortázar, Modiano and Murakami, and now Laura van den Berg, writes Randy Rosenthal for the Washington Post. The acclaimed author of two story collections and a novel, van den Berg has always been good, but with The Third Hotel, she's become fantastic in every sense of the word, he continues. So much subtextual lava is coursing under the surface of every page of The Third Hotel that the book feels like it's going to erupt in your hands. We are so pleased to host this event here at Harvard Bookstore tonight. Please join me in welcoming Paul Yoon and Laura van den Berg.
I'm going to do just a very brief reading, about 6 or so minutes, so I won't hold you in suspense. And I'm going to read from the novel's second chapter. The Third Hotel concerns a married couple named Clare and Richard is a horror film scholar, which is my secret dream job. I'm totally unqualified for it, but I would do it anyway. And he has plans to attend a film festival in Havana, and he's killed very suddenly in a hit-and-run car accident, and then Claire goes in his place, and things happen. So I'm going to read a little bit from the start of the second chapter, which sort of gets into what was going on in Claire and Richard's lives before his death. In her former life, Claire was a sales rep for ThyssenKrupp. Her area was elevator technologies, and her territory was the Midwest. She liked the job because it involved an endless amount of travel to seemingly anonymous places. She had been to Nebraska 47 times. What was there to see in Nebraska? A surprising amount, really. She knew where to get the best steak in Omaha. When she cut into it, blood pooled on the white plate. She had seen dawn turn the plains as lustrous and vast as an ocean. Once, late at night, she parked her rental car on the side of the road and walked into a cornfield. She stood on a dirt path surrounded by dark stalks and imagined a harrowing chase through the corn that culminated in her murder at the hands of a mass killer with a knife. In the night sky, she spotted the red flash of planes through gossamer clouds, and if she listened very carefully, more carefully than she had listened to anything in months or maybe even in years, she was able to make out the dull roar of their passing. She got back into her rental car and drove away and wondered if this was what people meant when they talked about mindfulness. Early in her career, she learned that one of the most important rules of travel was this: the answer to nearly everything could be found in the signs. This way to baggage claim, this way to the ticket counter, this way to Cleveland, this way to Omaha, this way to the hotel bar. Travel was one of the few arenas in life where clear and correct direction was so readily at hand. Lately, she had been tasked with selling a new kind of cable to find hotels and high-rise office buildings and factories. This cable was made of carbon fiber and allowed elevators to travel twice as fast as they could with steel. They lived in New Scotland, a town on the outskirts of Albany. In their condominium, she kept a small rolling suitcase in the bedroom closet, stocked with miniature toiletries, exercise clothes, an inflatable neck pillow, and the book she brought with her on every flight but could never seem to finish. The Two Faces of January by Patricia Highsmith. It wasn't an especially long novel, but on planes she could only read a few paragraphs before the words filled her with a crippling and inexplicable dread, driving the book back down into the depths of her shoulder bag. It was not so much the story that unsettled her, but the hidden things she sensed quivering under the surface. Subtext, she supposed this was called, and she did not care for it. Every time she saw her suitcase in the bedroom closet, tucked behind a mesh laundry bin, she imagined it was waiting for her second secret self. She traveled so frequently it was not uncommon for her to wake in the middle of the night and think for a moment, where am I? She did not find this disconcerting even when it happened in her own bed, but once she made the mistake of mentioning those midnight thoughts to her husband, and he looked at her like she was terminally ill. The travel had long been a point of contention between them. Why bother being married if you're always leaving? A reasonable question, and she couldn't say that she had an answer beyond the demands of her work. She wanted to be married, and she wanted to leave. The two did not seem mutually exclusive. She had this second secret self that she didn't know how to share with anyone, and when alone, that self came out into the open. In the months before his death, her husband's own secret self started coming out into the open too. She could only assume this other self had been waiting inside him all along. The year of the great change. He was the same and he was different. The way he looked when his sleep changed. His face used to be smooth and expressionless, almost mask-like, but then one night she found him sleeping with lips parted into a wide, unsettling smile. He switched coffee mugs, trading out The Exorcist for the ghoulish face of Michael Myers. He was newly skittish around dogs. He stopped adding salt to his food. He stopped eating bananas. His pace on the sidewalk changed. He used to be a brisk, impatient walker, and then one day he began moving so slowly and contemplatively, it was as though every tree branch was a source of wonder. Clare struggled to imagine what, 40 years into a life, would cause a person to suddenly change the way they walked. There were alien, interminable silences when she called from the road, and when she was home, he took long, solitary strolls in the evening hours, a symptom that would eventually lead to his demise. Another symptom. He started demanding to know what she did on the road, how she accounted for all those hours alone, no matter how many times she told him the simple truth. In a hotel room, her favorite thing in all the world was to switch off every light and everything that made a sound, TV, phone, air conditioner, faucets, and sit naked on the polyester comforter and count the breaths as they left her body. Naked, her husband would shout, as though she had provided him with damning evidence. He had been an angry person for as long as she had known him, but it was a secretive anger. Most people found him loose and lighthearted. Easygoing, that was the word people used, and in time, she became suspicious of anyone who could be described in such terms. What was so easy about going? Naked and alone, she would say back. Naked and alone. On her next trip, she thought about I skipped a paragraph. As a married couple, they'd had perfect years and they'd had shit years, but she had never in her life experienced a year that so thoroughly dismantled her with confusion. On her next trip, she thought about what he would see if he ever were to trail her on the road. A woman marking up sales reports with a pink highlighter. A woman watching workout infomercials with the volume on mute. A woman eating room service quesadillas in the bathtub instead of reading that novel she claimed to be nearly finished with. A woman doing a little exercise routine, squats and sit-ups, bicep curls with bottled waters, completed with the hope that he would notice the smooth lines when he put his hands on her body. A woman breathing naked on the toilet seat. A woman breathing naked in an armchair. A woman breathing naked before the bathroom mirror in the kind of lighting that could make a person reconsider every choice they had ever made in life. A woman breathing naked in the dark I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was a beautiful excerpt, and what I love about that, and what sort of stands out about it, is this this idea of the secret self, and sort of having kind of like layers of identity to Clare, and it made me think of when I was reading this novel and experiencing it. There were all these kind of disguises and layers of identity to it. There was sort of Richard, who is this kind of phantom, right? Is he alive or is he dead? He's sort of, every time he appears, he's sort of in, this kind of like, these sort of outfits. Later on, there's the famous actress who's kind of, wearing sunglasses and is, run away from the festival and is kind of living this covert life. Right, and then there's, there are these sort of smaller moments where there's, later on there's this person who has a fake ear, right? Again, like this kind of disguise where he can kind of take the ear off and sort of transform into someone else. And I was wondering if you could just sort of start off by talking about that, this kind of idea of like layers of identity in this book, this secret self, and what sort of that was about. In the Third Hotel.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I should also say Paul had to read like 500 million drafts, so no one knows this book, including myself, better than he does. So if there are questions that I can't answer or answer poorly, you should just ask Paul.
No, don't do that. Don't do that.
I think just generally, like, I'm very interested in how fiction can navigate the layers of the self. And I do think fiction is sort of uniquely designed to do that. And so there's the public self, the front-facing self, there's the private self, which is the self that we're cognizant of, but perhaps, we're not necessarily going around and showing to everyone. And there, I think, but the sort of more submerged realm of the secret self is perhaps of what is the greatest interest to me as a writer. And I think of the secret self as being the parts of us that we don't understand, or that we might not even be aware are kind of dwelling within our being, the things that we do that confuse us and bewilder us and maybe even shock us. Where are those impulses coming from? Where are those thoughts and feelings and actions coming from? And so I think, my ambition for the book certainly was to explore those layers of the self within Clare and Richard, and also the minor characters. As Paul mentioned, they're at a film festival. There's an actress that goes missing, and she's engaged in a kind of covert project that's not revealed until the end. There's a young filmmaker working for the festival who's also a sort of aspiring documentarian who's working on his own project. So there are all these kind of private narratives that Clare really does not have access to, and the reader in turn only has sort of partial access to. And so seeing kind of glimpses of private selves or even secret selves in the other characters as well. But I think for Clare, she's a character where at a certain point in the novel, the secret self, the part of the self that really shocks and bewilders and is alien even to us, has kind of taken over for her and is steering the narrative ship, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. And it made me sort of think about how, this is such a deep character study, right? It's Clare in multiple layers in this novel, right? It's all her. And yet we're sort of giving glimpses to these characters who have, one could argue just as many layers to them, right? And so were you ever at all tempted to, sort of have a kind of different kind of book where it was you were diving into other characters at all? Like, was it always this project where it was just going to be sort of Clare, or was this, does that make sense at all? Yeah.
It does, yeah. I'm always tempted to have a different kind of book, because I think in any
Sure.
novelist in the room, I think will understand that there's a moment that occurs. I see a smile of pained recognition. There's a moment that occurs where I think you're just sort of horrified by the terms that you've set for yourself as a novelist, and you kind of long for the book to be any other kind of book than than what it appears to want to be.
Right.
And certainly I had those moments, working on this novel, and I did, there were times where I wrote, and just, writing off the page, I think it was still useful, even if it didn't end up in the sort of the final thing, but I wrote chapters from other characters' perspectives. And I actually needed to do that for the actress to sort of understand what her story was that was going to be revealed, at the end, when this sort of secret project that she's been engaged in becomes public to a certain degree. And but I think, the more sort of I lived with this book, and it kind of would expand and shrink and expand and shrink, and I knew that I wanted it to be a really compact novel. Mm-hmm. I wanted it to be short and intense and sort of like a nightmare, but also maybe better than a nightmare in terms of how a reader experiences it. And I knew that was going to take a kind of real depth of focus, and I think that kind of atmospheric aspiration is probably at least one of the main factors in why the book is only narrated from Claire's point of view, wanting that focus, that intensity, the compactness, and that feeling that there's kind of no escape hatch from her perspective.
Was that difficult to sort of pull off or execute or kind of conceive? Because I sort of think of, I don't know how many, it just came out today, so I don't know how many of you have gotten a chance to sort of pick it up, but I think of this book as a kind of, it's that moment where, we've all lit a match before, right? And so we're like holding that match, and we have, like a few seconds, and it's both beautiful and terrifying, right? And you sort of feel that heat, and you're either going to, light a candle or a cigarette or whatever it is you're going to do with that match. And for me, this book embodies like those seconds, right, when the match is lit. And so, like, I don't even know if you can answer this, but how did you pull that off? Like, how did you keep that tone like alive and that kind of fire burning for 200 pages? Because it's relentless; it doesn't stop, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it took, novels take time, right? So it was certainly a process, and there were versions of this book that were much baggier than, the book that sits here on this table. Mm-hmm. This is definitely one of my most research-heavy projects. It was research-heavy because large portions of the book take place, this film festival in Havana. I made, a number of research trips to Havana. I read an extraordinary amount of film theory, and as someone who's sort of already like an armchair horror film theorist, there were drafts where it was like every neat thing that I've ever learned from film theory is in this book, and characters will just say these things to each other at random, apropos of absolutely nothing. I'm sure you recall reading those drafts, unless you...
No, not at all.
Yeah, repressed it. Very, very charitable. So I think that it was really, I think sometimes you have to put in this case, I really feel like I had to put in too much of everything to understand what could be pulled out.
Yeah, sure.
And particularly in the parts of the novel that necessitated a lot of research to overwrite, to over-research, to oversight, to over-include. And that actually, seeing that sort of thicket and that density helped me understand, where can I cut and where can I pare down.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the research of this? Just because I was sort of fortunate enough to, sort of tag along and be your research assistant whenever, when we went to Havana and Cuba and the countryside as well. And I'm sort of dying to hear about this because, like, I think our processes are slightly different when it comes to research, where I do very little. True, and only toward the end do I kind of get into it just to make sure, like, I didn't, screw anything up really, really bad, right? And to sort of make sure that I'm honoring, a place or a culture. But I remember you were just, I think you had gone to Cuba 4 times before this book was done. And you were also, I just remember like stacks of film theory, in our apartment, and it just made me feel like I was in college again, So do you want to talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I haven't done I've done some research, but not sort of vast amounts of research for past books. But no, this did feel different. I think also for a while, so when I'm between projects, it's my practice to keep a kind of thought log, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a sort of a running log of my thoughts, and I'm paying attention, and I'm thinking about like what might the next thing be. I'm paying attention to what recurs and what keeps coming up. And I found that I was writing a lot about travel in the context of both work and tourism. I had been sort of coming off a period where I was traveling a lot. My second and third books came out fairly close to each other, and so I had a few really travel-heavy years. Deeper into the chapter that I read, there are passages where Clare recounts all of the like really upsetting things she's found in transit spaces, in the backs of like seat pockets on planes, and she finds a fingernail in a hotel room drawer. And I'm so sorry to report that they're by far the most autobiographical parts of this novel. So. And I think with the tourism piece, I was born and raised in Orlando, Florida, which is a part of the state where both the economy and culture have been really powerfully shaped by tourism. It's a huge part of the way that Florida is narrated, both within the city and also by outsiders. So the language of tourism, how we narrate the places we visit, what's highlighted, what's left out of the narrative altogether, all of those questions have always been very interesting to me, and sort of on my radar. And I was also writing quite a lot about horror. And then, when President Obama loosened the travel regulations, and all of a sudden, Cuba has been a very popular destination for tourists who are not American for a very long time, but there was this huge influx of American tourists, and all of a sudden Havana was in like every travel magazine, every travel blogger was writing about Havana, and I was very interested in how the place was being narrated, and again, what was being highlighted, what was being foregrounded, and what was being left out of the narrative altogether. So I had this sort of constellation of ideas in this thought log, but I was like, how on earth do I put together travel, tourism, horror films, marriage, aging parents was another thing, aging sick parents, all in one space. And so one thing where research was so vital, not only in giving me sort of a necessary education on particular subjects, but also showing me where the points of intersection were. And so the more I read scholarships on tourism and the more that I read film scholarships, the more I was struck by the overlap in vocabulary. So, if you're reading about tourism, you'll hear writers use phrases like lenses and gazes and vantages and angles, very similar to cinematic language and cinematic vocabulary. I saw a lecture by a scholar named Paloma Duong, who is at MIT, and she was talking about consumer culture in Havana. And I was, again, very struck by how the language that she was using was very similar to that of cinematic language. So it was actually, I have to sort of credit research in a way for allowing me to see how these different subjects could belong in the same universe and how they could connect to each other and how they could speak to each other. And I frankly, don't think those are connections I would have been able to make purely on my own.
Yeah, totally. That sort of made me think of like setting in this book, right? A lot of sort of people talk about, Cuba and Havana for this novel, but this book is set in the Midwest. It's set in upstate New York. It's set in Florida, right? Her parents are in Florida. Her father's in Florida. They meet in the Midwest, but she also works in the Midwest. They live in upstate New York, right? And so, like, a lot of the pivotal moments in this story are actually occurring outside of Havana, right? And so, it was just sort of made me think about, like, how did you juggle, like, all the sort of disparate settings, right? Because they're so disparate, Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things that unites them is that they're all transit spaces in one way or another. Clare is a transient event in that a film festival is a temporary event with a lot of people who are also foreigners. So she's a transient presence there. She's a visitor. She has also a particular relationship to travel and tourism, I should say, because her parents were innkeepers in North Florida. So she grew up in a hotel in Jacksonville Beach. So she was sort of the kind of stationary presence that other people or other travelers orbited around. And then as a sales rep, as an adult, is constantly on the road and traveling, all around the Midwest, finding fingernails and hotel room drawers and whatnot. And then, I think even her home with Richard, because of that in upstate New York, it's sort of like a hub. She goes home, she sees him, she showers, she eats something, she sleeps and goes to the office, and then she's back on the road again. So I think having that sort of quadrant of spaces, the Midwest, upstate New York, childhood in Florida, and then also the film festival, I think allowed me to explore transit spaces and travel in different contexts, which felt rich to me. And I'm also, I should just say, super interested in the possibilities of transit spaces more generally. I mean, I think that there's such rich anonymity and intimacy in travel spaces. If you've ever, I don't know, seen someone fall asleep next to you on a plane and they're dreaming. I mean, that's so intimate. But there's also this kind of pact of silence around it too. Like there's all this intimacy that we're observing, but it would be against social protocol to sort of wake up the person and be like, hey, is it a good dream? Is it weird? What's happening in your subconscious right now? Like we can't, there's this sense that you kind of can't comment on it. I mean, there's a sort of pact of silence. So I think I think just opposite charges and tension are often propulsive in fiction. And so to think about like that contrast between anonymity and intimacy, and Claire as a child having these like very intimate and often very unsettling encounters with guests, but also she's totally anonymous to them at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of makes me think of this beautiful line that I love so much in this book, which is the traveler was not a peaceful presence in the world. And the kind of, and that for me sort of embodies so much of this book, in that like there are so many, it's sort of there's an aggression to like Clare being in Havana in like multiple ways, right? Which I thought was really sort of beautiful. We just kind of like hit the ground running, and I completely forgot to sort of talk about like the most obvious question, which is, I've sort of had the privilege of knowing how this project started, which is I think in 2013 maybe you had written a short story that ended in Havana. Am I right in that?
Yes,
right?
It was a little earlier. It was like 2011-ish.
Okay,
yeah.
2011, and it wasn't like a story set in Havana, but I think it ended there, right? And so, and I remember that was a short story, and then the kind of sort of the seed of Cuba just kind of stuck with you ever since then, right? Like sort of 7 years later. And I was just wondering if you could kind of talk about the trajectory of that, just like starting from a short story that, didn't really have a lot to do with Cuba, but ended in Havana, and then just like from there to this kind of, to this novel. Yeah.
Yeah, I did write a short story. It was about a couple that they're on a trip in Key West, and they steal, through various circumstances, they end up stealing a luxury yacht that's been a sort of ghost ship at sea. Turns out to not be a super great idea. And fairly soon they're found by this couple who are clearly it's too complicated to summarize. It does not go well, but the story ends with the stolen luxury yacht arriving in the port of Havana, and I did write, I think it was like 2011 or 2012. I did write a very fast, short draft of a novel that was really like an extension of that story. And I feel like in my experience as a story writer, a story is a story, a novel is a novel. And the idea that you could just like take a short story and be like, what if I just made it 3 times as long? It will just be a short story that's way too long, which is exactly what happened with this. So I felt kind of compelled to do it. I didn't have anything else to do, so I did it. But I sort of was able to recognize fairly quickly that this is not a project that was a good use of my time, and I just sort of set it completely aside. But I think, certainly, when Havana came back into the kind of public discourse in terms of being this, marketed as a newly discovered travel destination for American tourists, I mean, I think it kind of re-enlivened that interest. But it was also the couple that really stayed with me. I mean, that was the first. They as characters have both evolved, necessarily through time and by getting to kind of exist in their own story. But early on, they were kind of blueprint for Clare and Richard. And so it was not only, place, but also those two characters that really kind of sunk their claws in.
Yeah, totally. I wanna open it up to the audience very soon, but I thought I'd just ask you one more question. And I don't know if this is going to embarrass you or not, but I hope not.
I can't wait.
I just remember, again, this is, just a place of, privilege. It's just like, I just remember when you were working on this, you would, I just remember, like you would call me if you were, somewhere else or at a residency or something, and you would just be bawling. You would be crying and literally just like it would not be a conversation. It would just be you bawling, and I think it was just sort of you didn't know how this was going to end, right? You didn't know how to finish this project. There were times. Sorry, I'm getting emotional thinking about it, but it's like there were times when you didn't know how to finish this project, right? It's like, I've been through so much, right there with you, and it, there were just like certain sort of. There are writers in this room, there are like certain puzzles you just couldn't figure out, right? There were like obstacles you couldn't figure out. There were structural issues. There were, you name it. And so I know there are a lot of writers in this room. How did, and just wondering, like, how did you like persevere? How did you keep it going,
Yeah, I mean, that's not an understatement. I think that you might be imagining, in particular, a long stretch when I was at a residency in New Hampshire. It was a beautiful place. There was nothing wrong with the place. But I got into this horrible loop of it. The novel's in 3 parts, and the third part was I think also when you're writing something that has this kind of intensity and is operating on a sort of dream logic, a really important question and challenging one is how do you get out of it? How do you get out of it? How do you bring things to a culmination? How do you maybe resolve sort of 1 or 2 questions in a way that doesn't pierce the mystery, but you don't also have the feeling of a car just sort of skidding to a stop.
But also have beautiful open ends, right, where not everything is answered.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. How to bring the events to a place of culmination without sort of answering questions that might diminish the work to answer explicitly, and I got into this sort of terrible loop of like I would work for like 12 hours a day, and then I would go to sleep at night and was like, maybe I've cracked it. And I would wake up in the morning and immediately start reading pages and think, oh no, definitely not. And then I would go out and stand in the woods and cry and call Paul.
But you did this kind of brilliant thing where,
never got any better either while I was in New Hampshire.
But you figured it out, and there's this kind of brilliant thing where, I don't want to give too much away, but there's a kind of intense claustrophobic stage in this book, and then, third act, it sort of breaks it, right? It breaks that stage. You leave that stage for a different stage, and I just thought it was kind of a brilliant artistic move to kind of leave a stage. It was so simple and yet so brilliant to me. And I'm just like super proud that you figured it out,
Me too. And I think that to go back to that,
for sure.
And you're like, and I'm so relieved we never have to discuss it again. But I think also, but to go back to your question, which is a good one. And I think for anyone who's written a novel, you've been in that place where you're just like, there's just this sort of fundamental thing that I cannot think my way around this, and I do think a huge part of it is just staying with it,
Right.
having the sort of
Right.
fortitude and in somewhere, even if you've lost faith in the project, some sort of even if it feels like, misplaced faith, to just keep going, and that was, to quote Batman, the darkest before the dawn. And I think sometimes it is that way. Or I guess, was that Commissioner Gordon or Batman?
I don't know.
It's not, okay. It's not. It's
You're
not
on your own for that one.
It's not important. But that I do think that is true for novel writing also, that a huge part of it is just staying with the pages, and sort of trusting, which is a huge leap of faith, because of course there are no guarantees. But trusting that if you just stay in the room for long enough, a door will open. And that's all you need. You don't need to solve every problem in a day. You just need that one essential door to open that you can walk through, that will get you to the next door, and then to the next door, and to the next door.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. On that note, do any of you have any questions? I just thought I'd kind of open it up to the floor here.
New you're thinking about, Laura, next project?
I'm working on short stories right now. So I have a hazy idea for what a next novel might be, but for now I'm working on short stories, which my first 2 collections were stories, and it's my first love. So I'm happy to be back.
This kind of builds on the last topic that you were discussing. How do you balance planning out the plot and sort of just writing and seeing where the characters and story want to go?
Yeah, I think I move through different things at different stages. I think for me, I need to write first drafts quickly and in an almost kind of unthinking way, which I know sounds counterintuitive. And what I mean by that is not thoughtlessness, but just that I'm not thinking in sort of the up top, critical, cerebral part of my brain. I'm trying to sort of dwell in that secret self, that secret space, where if things are coming up and I don't know why, or I don't know what they're doing there, I just sort of put them down and move on. But certainly for subsequent drafts, really every draft that comes after that, it's extraordinarily important to begin to think more strategically. How are these things connected? How is one sort of conversation that the book is having resonant with these other conversations that the book is having or trying to have? And so at certain points in the process, I definitely did all kinds of organizational stuff. I made charts, I made outlines, I did a bunch of color-coded stuff on note cards. I'm very visual, so I like to put stuff, note cards on a wall and then move them around and see what happens if, you change the order of scenes or if you change the order of chapters. But I don't do anything like that until I'm fairly deep into the process.
Apropos of your initial comments, did you ever reach a place where sort of you had these vague beginning notions of what the book might be, and then somewhere in the middle you find that you have 2 diametrically opposed goals in the novel, and they just both can't be executed, so you have to make some kind of choice, and how do those choices work out for you?
Yeah, I think I've definitely experienced at least a version of that. I think one thing that's inherently challenging about writing a novel is that, so I worked on this book for 5 years, which for a novel, it's a long time, but it's not an extraordinary, I have very dear friends who've written wonderful books that took 10 years, 8 years, 12 years, and it's not an exceptionally long time for a novel. But I think even over 5 years, I changed, I feel I had different experiences. I maybe looked at the world differently or looked at some piece of the world differently. And I think I always find it quite challenging that, I change and then the work changes. And then maybe you look at the pages that were written a year ago and you think, this just doesn't sort of make sense to me anymore. So I think that and this was true for my first novel also, that both both those books went through really radical transformations and took very different shapes, maybe several times over the course of the process. And it was always really, really frightening because you're like, I've been walking this path, I believe in this path. Every morning that I tell myself I believe in this path. And then, but I think I remember feeling sort of tremendous, apprehension before making some kind of radical change, but then almost always feeling immediate relief. Sort of like I've been maybe fighting what the book has grown into or fighting what the book wants it to be because it's running counter to the expectations that I had for it going in. And I do feel strongly that one of the greatest challenges for ourselves in revision process-wise is kind of transcending the limitations that we've set for ourselves in drafts. But I think it can also take us a long time to understand what those limitations are and how maybe we've been sort of arguing with them. But with both my novels, there were several points where the whole thing had to be kind of dismantled and then sort of built again from the ground up. But there was no way getting around that work. It was very important.
I've read a lot of your short stories, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for me, it seems like a lot of the topics that come up are these women in these fraught relationships and going through in these very foreign spaces. How do you differentiate between all these different stories and these characters when they sort of operate in the same space almost?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. So the question was, that's certainly true that there's overlap characters in fraught relationships, and often sort of travel in different kinds of travel contexts, and how do they remain distinct in my mind? Yeah, and I do think that there's certainly echoes, and one character can in some ways kind of bleed into another, and I don't. I think they're just, there's so many different kinds of writers out there, and for some writers, each work it's just radically different from what's come before. And there are other writers where you can definitely see sort of recurring tropes and conversations that are happening, over the course of several books. And I think I would belong to the latter category, where there is similarity between the characters for sure. But I think for me, I'm often asking similar questions in my work, but also thinking about how can I maybe look at a similar question in a different context, and what there does need to be something distinct and truly different about this character as compared, to characters that have already been written by me in order to hold my interest. So I think I would lose interest quickly if I was literally writing kind of the same character and the same character, even if it's variations on a theme. There does need to be some sort of clear variation in my mind in order for the character to remain interesting to me.
Thank you for what you've read. That was wonderful to hear. I'm just curious, as you continue to grow and evolve and change, and you look back on your work, how do you know when it's done, since you will always continue to grow and evolve and change and have a different perspective? And then I would also like to know, what's your favorite sentence that you've ever read?
Okay. I'm going to answer the first question to stall for the second one. I mean, that's the age-old question, right? When Zadie Smith has this wonderful essay called "That Crafty Feeling," and she tells this, highly recommended to all the writers in the room, or just anyone. It's fantastic. And she talks about being at a literary festival in England, and she's watching this writer who is preparing to go on ahead of her, and he's in like a book form. Like, so he's furiously line editing the novel that was published 4 years ago. And she has this great line where she's like, it turns out the ideal headspace to be in to revise your novel is 4 years after publication. Sadly, that option is not usually available to us. So we just sort of have to make do. I mean, I think that there's not necessarily, frustratingly, a completely clear answer to that. Sometimes you have a deadline. Sometimes you've given the project everything you have and you believe in it and you think it's ready to sort of live on its own, or at least to try and live on its own. I think that, for me, it's important to feel like I set out to try and say something, and I've said it in the most precise, I've attempted to say it in the most precise language that is available to me. That's sort of my bar. At the same time, were I to reread this book 5 years from now, I'm sure that, which I will never do, I'm sure that I would see things, and would make changes, and I would think, oh, why would you write that scene like that? And here's this moment that I would imagine in a completely different way. So I think, Lori Moore has a great line where she says, if one publishes, one is creating a public record of learning to write, and I think that's absolutely true. And so, you see, often if you do read a writer's body of work, you see them sort of working through different questions and kind of refining that art of naming, whatever it is, whatever material the author is seeking to name, sort of over the course of their career. And I think we have to make peace with some degree of imperfection and some degree of unfinishedness. As for the favorite sentence, I think I really like I do really like, sincerely, the line that you mentioned about how a traveler is not a peaceful presence in the world, which is at the very start of part 3. But yes, it's just a traveler was not a peaceful presence in the world. And I'm favorite is hard, but I'm quite fond of that line.
So we talked about everyone has a different version of the self. There's the public self, there's the secret self, and I assume you put a lot of yourself in this book. Do you ever at any point worry about you exposing yourself too much? Or, is there any point where you're like, gosh, I really shouldn't show my husband that? Just wondering, if you have that kind of experience.
Yeah, I think Paul's editing skills ultimately superseded any anxieties that I had. And I also think that, it's interesting. I think for me, there is actually very autobiographical material in this novel, but it's not the stuff that would be obvious necessarily to an outside reader. So the obvious thing would be, I'm a married person, there's a married woman having particular kind of conversation with her husband. The marital sort of through line is probably the least autobiographical part of the book, even though I myself am married. I think this is the great thing about fiction too, unless you're working in kind of the autofiction vein, and particularly fiction that deals in the supernatural or the fantastic, you can have all this really personal stuff that's sort of buried under wild flights of imagination and artifice. So it's I don't. It's not a huge source of anxiety for me, partly because, the nature of the work is not, one wouldn't read it and think, oh, wow, I bet Laura did exactly this thing that Claire did. But I'm definitely in there. And I think that's true for all of my books too. And, but I think it probably would be difficult to sort of pick out, what was me and what isn't. And that's hard for me too, even, sometimes for me the line isn't clear. What is really sort of an independent fictional entity, and what is sort of, me.
Were there any particular horror films that were influential in the crafting of this story?
Yes. I got Paul to watch. He's historically, you're not, I would say, historically a fan of the genre, but I'm slowly, a years-long conversion has been in process, and I feel we're making some headway. Yeah, I mean, tons. There, a lot of the sort of the canonical classics where I revisited. I think the original Halloween is an absolute masterpiece, and it's a masterpiece in the art of anticipation. It's a very tight, so thinking about the sort of claustrophobia and tension, it's 85 minutes long, but no one, save for the opening sequence, and there are no murders for 55 minutes. It's all this sort of claustrophobic anticipation. And so I actually really studied that movie, and there are a few Halloween homages in the novel. with like a closet and different things, and also stuff, some newer films, films by women. I love Jennifer Kent's The Babadook is great, and I think I love the ambiguity in that movie too, where you have a mother and a son who've been under kind of tremendous psychological duress for various reasons, and they're being menaced by this presence in a house, and it's sort of, the presence is a real thing, but it's also sort of generated by the psychic state in which they've been in. So stories that, narratives that kind of toe that line between, is the haunting coming from the outside or is it coming from within, or both simultaneously. And also a movie called Juan of the Dead, which came out in 2011, was regarded by many film critics as the first Cuban zombie movie, which was another point of connection between like film, tourism, Havana, kind of came into focus with that movie, and it's fantastic.
You talked about working out questions in successive novels. I was wondering what the questions were that you think you were trying to work out in this book, and did you work them out?
I think, a lot of different questions. I think, certainly sort of the age-old question of how well can we know those that are closest to us, and does it matter, in a way? Like if we just decide that that's sort of an irresolvable question, how does that impact our relationships? Should it be something that we're not particularly preoccupied with? I'm also, I'm interested in the form of the travel novel. There are a lot of travel novels that I really love, that I feel very influenced by. I also think, particularly the American abroad sort of subset of the travel novel is a very fraught genre and has a lot of baggage too. So I was interested in kind of looking at that baggage and thinking about it, and thinking about how could maybe the form of the travel novel be stretched, or be sort of reinvented or reinterpreted. And that was certainly, it's up to readers whether I was successful in that, of course, but that was certainly an ambition that I had, or question that I had. Is this a viable form? Should it be a viable form, et cetera? And also sort of just the interplay between film and literature, and what it would be like to incorporate sort of cinematic tropes into a text, and how that would translate or not.
Laura, I was just wondering about your use of genre fiction. And Paul talked about how much research you do, and I was wondering if reading genre fiction is part of the research, because I thought of that, and it sounds like there's a ghost story, maybe, kind of, and then of course refinement too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love work that works with genre, however it's classified. I mean, another amazing horror movie that I really love is A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which is it was described, I think, by the filmmaker as a spaghetti Western vampire film, and it's black and white, so it's sort of heavily stylized, and it's retro, it's goth, it's punk, it's ultra modern, it's industrial, and I think that to like pin it on astrology, I think as a Gemini, I'm drawn to different elements that don't seem like they should go together, but then when you put them in the same space with the right proportions, it's totally magical. And I felt that way about A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, that if someone had described that to me and said it does this and it does this and it does this, I'd be like, I can't see it. But then you do see it, and the director has such total control over her material that it's like transcendent. And so there are a lot of science fiction writers there are a lot of speculative writers that I love, and certainly reading into genre has always been important to me, for sure. Jeff Vandermeer's The Southern Reach Trilogy is one that comes to mind immediately. Also amazing, particularly the first one, Annihilation, which evokes very much a kind of extra weird version of North Florida, is really actually one of sort of the best like Florida set books that's come out in the last few years for my money, and has that beautiful ambiguity about there's deep strangeness in the landscape, but also it's sort of conversant with this psychological strangeness, and how these two sort of force fields create this deliciously like suspenseful, vivid, intense environment. Thank you so much.